Jaya Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Vrajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Vrajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada. Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Shri Shri Radha Radhanath ki jai, Shri Giriraj Govardhan ki jai, Shri Gaura Hari ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Gaur Premanande. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naran Chaivam Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirayat. Shinvata Swagata Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtanaha Hridiyantasto hi abhadrani vidunoti suritsatam Nashtaprayeshu abhadreshu nityam bhagavata sevaya Bhagavati uttama shlokir bhaktir bhavati naishtiki. Hare Krishna. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4, Chapter 21, Instructions by Maharaj Prithu, text number 6. Pujita pujayam asa Tatra tatra mahayashaha Pauran janapadam stam stan Prita priya varapradaha Pujita pujayam asha Tatra tatra mahayasha Pauranjana padam stam stan Prita priya varapradaha Pujita pujayam asha Tatra tatra mahayasha Pauran janapadam stam stan Prita priyavara pradaha Pujita pujayam asha Tatra tatra mahayashaha Pauranjana padam stam stan Prita priyavara pradaha Pujita pujayam asha Tatra tatra mahayashaha Pauranjana padam stam stan Prita priyavara pradam Pujita, being worshipped. Pujayam asha, offered worship. Tatra tatra, here and there. Mahayasha, with a background of great activities. Pauran, the noble men of the city. Janapadan, common citizens. Tan tan, in that way. Prita, being satisfied. Priya Varaprada, was ready to offer them all benediction. Translation. Both the important citizens and the common citizens welcomed the king very heartily, and he also bestowed upon them their desired blessings. Purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. A responsible king was always approachable by his citizens. Generally, the citizens, great and common, all had an aspiration to see the king and take benediction from him. The king knew this, and therefore, whenever he met the citizens, he immediately fulfilled their desires or mitigated their grievances. In such dealings, a responsible monarchy is better than a so-called democratic government, in which no one is responsible to mitigate the grievances of the citizens, who are unable to personally meet the supreme executive head. In a responsible monarchy, the citizens had no grievances against the kingdom, and even if they did, they could approach the king directly for immediate satisfaction. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Mena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Mena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam. Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha. Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namastute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vishabhanu Sate Devi Panamami Hari Priya Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. Thank you for this opportunity to share something of my understanding of today's verse. As always, I ask the blessings of all the Vaishnavas assembled that I may say something that is in line with Srila Prabhupada's teachings as well as pleasing to the ears and heart of all the Vaishnavas. So we're continuing to read about Maharaj Prithu and his return, his entrance into the kingdom and his interaction with all the citizens. And we are getting a small glimpse into seeing what it's like to live under a God-conscious ruler, a God-conscious king or devotee. Someone whose whole aim in leadership is not any kind of exploitation. Someone who's simply there to serve all the citizens. And we were reading yesterday when Jai Prabhu was speaking how when he entered, he was welcomed so lavishly, but his humility never wavered. He remained very grave, and he wasn't the least bit affected by anything. And the example is given how a tree with a lot of fruit is low hanging and bows down. So naturally the king, just maintained that position. So the whole aim of divine leadership, is to protect actually and to see to the welfare of everyone. When I was reading this verse, it reminded me of the pastime in the Krishna book where the Brahmana is losing his sons and he blames the king for that. That's chapter 89, the second last chapter of the Krishna book. So I thought I'd just read the little excerpt from there, how the Brahmana comes and, he comes to Krishna and Arjuna and he's fighting and he's banging on the gates. Every time his child dies, he comes with the body, I think, the dead body of the child, and he bangs on the gates. So Prabhupada writes that the king is liable. The king was so responsible, we read in the first canto, for the comforts of the citizens, that he was to see that there was not even any excessive heat or cold. Now the Brahmana whose child had died, thinking there was no fault on his own part, immediately went to the palace door with the dead child in his arms and accused the king. The Brahmana is speaking. The present king Ugrasena is envious of the Brahmanas. The exact word used in this connection is Brahmadvisa. One who is envious of the Vedas, of a qualified Brahman, or of the Brahman caste is called Brahmadvis. So the king was accused of being Brahmadvis. He was also accused of being Satadi, falsely intelligence. The executive head of state must be very intelligent to see to the comforts of the citizens. But according to the Brahmana, the king was not at all intelligent, although he was occupying the royal throne. Therefore the Brahmana also called him Labdha, which means greedy. In other words, a king or an executive head of state should not occupy the exalted position or post of president or king if he is greedy and self-interested. But it is natural that an executive head becomes self-interested when he is attached to material enjoyment. Therefore, another word used here is Visayatmanaha. The Brahman also accused the king of being Kshatriya Bandhu, which refers to a person born in a family of Kshatriyas or the royal order, but lacking the qualifications of a royal personality. A king should protect Brahminical culture and should be very alert to the welfare of his citizens. He should not be greedy due to attachment to material enjoyment. If a person with no qualifications represents himself as a Kshatriya of the royal order, he is not called a Kshatriya, but a Kshatriya Bandhu. Similarly, if a person is born of a Brahmana father, but has no Brahminical qualification, he is called a Brahma Bandhu or Dvija Bandhu. This means that a Brahmana or Kshatriya is not accepted simply by birth. One has to qualify himself for the particular position. Only then is he accepted as a Brahmana or a Kshatriya. Thus the Brahmana charged that his newly born baby was dead due to the disqualifications of the king. The Brahmana took it to be most unnatural, and therefore he held the king responsible. We also find in Vedic history that if a Kshatriya king was irresponsible, sometimes a consulting board of Brahmanas maintained by the monarchy would dethrone him. Considering all these points, it appears that the post of monarch in the Vedic civilization is a very responsible one. The Brahmana therefore said, "No one should offer respects or worship to a king whose only business is envy. Such a king spends his time either hunting and killing animals in the forest or killing citizens for criminal acts. He has no self-control and possesses bad character. If such a king is worshipped or honored by the citizens will never be happy. They will always remain poor, full of anxiety and aggrievement, and always unhappy." In modern politics, the post of monarch has been abolished, and the president is not held responsible for the comforts of the citizens. In this age of Kali, the executive head of a state somehow or other gets votes and is elected to an exalted post, but the condition of the citizens continues to be full of anxiety, distress, unhappiness, and dissatisfaction. Prabhupada really hits the nail on the head. And it's so interesting, even though, much time has passed since he's given this purport, it's the same in Kali Yuga. In fact, it's getting worse. There continues to be anxiety, distress, dissatisfaction, because we do not have, among many things, a qualified head of state. My Guru Maharaj gives this example. It's a very old example because I've heard this in a very old lecture, so I'm not entirely sure what year this was. But he speaks about, there was a North American governor who was running for a state, and he was, traveling around all the different states and canvassing. He was this old guy, but he would go around, and during his campaigns, he would hold a bottle of whiskey in one hand and have his young secretary on the other side. And he would only say, "This is our program, whiskey and woman." Yeah! And everyone would just get into it. And I think he actually won. This is our program, Whiskey and Woman. So this is the state of current affairs. And if it goes on in this way, as it will go on, because this is Kali Yuga, there will only be anxiety, dissatisfaction, problems will increase, right? But Prabhupada in this purport is speaking about responsibility. The responsible king, he's always approachable by his citizens. In a morning walk, a disciple asked Srila Prabhupada, how do we define responsibility in Krishna consciousness? Shri Shri Radha Radhanath ki jai, Shri Giriraj Govardhan ki jai, Shri Gaura Hari ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. How do we define responsibility? And Prabhupada says that responsibility means you do your duty. Whether it is material or spiritual, you simply do your duty. And as we read through the pastime of Maharaj Prithu, we see that, he didn't do, in one sense, anything extraneous to become the king, to make himself an empowered personality. He simply did his duty as ordained by the Lord. He followed the instructions. And yes, he did some austerities, but basically he did what he had to do as the head of state, right? In accordance with the rules of Lord Vishnu. And if you oppose that to someone, say like Hiranyakashipu, and the austerity that he performed to empower himself, such vigorous, physical, painful austerity. But the nature of the austerity and the nature of the empowerment is so different. If you say, Hiranyakashipu, he went through all of that simply for himself. And Maharaj Prithu simply followed his duty as accordance with Shastra, and he was so empowered by the Lord, right? And you can say, yes, Srila Prabhupada, the example of Srila Prabhupada, he also performed austerity, he also struggled a lot in his service, but because it was based on the order of the Lord, his empowerment was so divine and so great, right? So we understand that the empowerment of a devotee, it doesn't come from necessarily the austerity itself that they performed, but rather from the mercy of the Lord. Because everything that they want to do is simply for the Lord's pleasure. Srila Prabhupada says that our criteria of success in life is whether or not Krishna is pleased. That is our criteria. And then again, someone asks, well, how do you know that Krishna is pleased? And Prabhupada says, well, if the sadhus are pleased, if the guru is pleased, if the Vaishnava is pleased, then automatically you can understand that Krishna is pleased. In a room conversation, Prabhupada is speaking also about this fourth canto, the Maharaj Prithu. He's speaking about some of the earlier chapters. And he's speaking, I think this is in Jaipur, he's talking about the Raja Rishis, the saintly kings, right? And he says that this Raja Rishi, this king who is, supervising the administration of the state, but his character should be just like a rishi, a saintly person, a great sage. And that is the qualification of a king, of a leader, that their character is saintly. And Prabhupada goes on to explain, he says that, a saintly person is always concerned with the unhappiness of everyone. And he takes the responsibility of sharing Krishna consciousness because he is concerned with this unhappiness, with the welfare of everyone. And Prabhupada says that a saintly person means that they should be interested in public welfare. But actually the real public welfare, which is, the nature of the soul, of our spiritual life. And Prabhupada says, yes, public welfare means that every citizen should be Krishna conscious, basically. And then they will be happy, they will be satisfied, they will be peaceful, all of that, both materially and spiritually, simply by becoming Krishna conscious. And Prabhupada concludes and he says, my point is that our Krishna consciousness movement is not a selfish movement. which I thought was very interesting. And how to be a selfless person, it means you have to take responsibility, specifically responsibility in service, because it is engagement in service that makes you selfless, because you're not doing this for yourself. We're serving for the pleasure of the Lord, and only that. That's our criteria. But we know in this modern age, the modern era, we have what's called, the diplomatic runaround. You know, just you can go to any government department with a complaint. Try filing one complaint about something, and they say, no, this is the wrong department. Go here. You go there. No, go to this person. Go to this person. They'll send you here, there, everywhere. Eventually, you just give up because no one wants to take responsibility, right? Prabhupada says famously, it's not democracy, it's demon crazy, right? And you see this in the modern world, in certain organizations or institutions. If you're trying to contact someone, you can't even talk to a person anymore. You phone, you get an automated message. Press 1 for this, press 2 for this, press 3, you press, then again, press, and you just talk to a robot, I know in America, there are even like grocery stores that are like, there's no human employee at all. I think Amazon has these grocery stores, it's like self-checkout, self-monitoring, a robot like restocks the shelves, all of these things, right? No one wants to be responsible for anyone. We don't even want to be responsible for ourselves. We just want to pass the buck on to someone else, And if you think about this, even on a spiritual life, the concept of responsibility and accountability, do we really want to take responsibility for our own spiritual life? How much responsibility do we want to take? Is it easier to just rely on someone else to be spiritual for us? No, I'm part of such and such spiritual organization, and my advancement is based on that alone. There's nothing further than that. But Prabhupada is speaking in Paris once on a morning walk again about this concept of responsibility. And he says, I think it's Yogeshwar Das, who asks him, how do we define responsibility in Krishna consciousness or in spiritual life? And Prabhupada says, responsibility means that you have got this human form of life, realize God. This is your responsibility. Otherwise, you are finished. 3 words. You have got this human form of life. Your only responsibility is to understand God. This is your responsibility. A very straightforward answer. We only have, at the end of the day, one order of business, and that is to realize our relationship with Krishna. Striking difference to today's day and age. And we see, in this verse and this purport, the personal relationship between the king and the citizens, that not only the important citizens, but even the common citizens welcomed Maharaj Prithu so personally and so heartily, and he in turn bestowed upon all of them their desired blessings. And the first line of the purport, a responsible king is always approachable by his citizens, And, whenever he was able to meet them, he fulfilled their desires. He mitigated their grievances. He's always approachable. Because they had this, relationship where they could approach the Lord personally, naturally accountability comes up in this space. When I have a personal relationship with someone, when I'm answerable to someone, I naturally take on responsibility and I hold myself accountable to something in that way, right? And that is ultimately why Prabhupada is saying that this kind of monarchy makes it far superior to democracy. In democracy, we're all about passing the blame onto someone else. Like, yes, you voted us in, but then when you vote them in, realize they're not all they're cut out to be. And then, well, you're stuck with them for another, however long the term is. But as Prabhupada was saying in the Krishna book, that, there's a Brahminical order that if things are not going according to the way they should be, they can dethrone the king. And in this age, what would that be? Like a coup, kind of. But that's always like violence. There's a lot of violence in that kind of thing. But this accountability and responsibility, and in the word, I think it's in the word for word. Yeah, the first word, being worshipped and offering worshipped. It's a very reciprocal relationship. It's not that I sit here and I receive everything and, that's the end of that. Because I am a king, I deserve X, Y, and Z. No, not at all. Because the citizens are honoring Prithu Maharaj in such a way, he honors them with his attention. And we see that in a personal relationship when we have the undivided attention of someone. You're just having a conversation, like if I'm talking to Rukmini, if I'm actually listening to her versus, she's talking to me and I'm just on my phone. It's very different. It makes a big difference. So the attention and the focus that we get really builds the personal relationship between us. While I was preparing for this lecture, the devotee who was speaking was saying how at a Janmashtami program, this was in the San Diego temple, so at that time the sort of GBC in charge or managerial person was Shesha Prabhu, disciple of Prabhupada. So he decided for this Janmashtami, he would sit, wherever he would sit, and he would just listen to everyone in the community, in the congregation, whatever they came with, good or bad, he would just listen to them, and he would try his best to do something. That's what he did for one Janmashtami. As the managerial authority, as the GBC representative, he would make himself available to every single person in the congregation on Janmashtami. Sure, imagine that, right? And that's the thing. Why Maharaj Prithu as well? We know he's an empowered incarnation. And we were saying earlier, yes, he's empowered because he simply performs his duty as according to the rules and regulations of the Lord, And also because he sees his position and his leadership as a service, not as an entitlement, or a privilege. He doesn't, consider himself elevated and privileged to be king. He considers it the highest service to be in this position. And naturally, when we see our situation as a position of service, we will be inclined to be accountable to someone. That's the nature of service, right? It grows the selflessness in us when it's done correctly, right? So how do we maybe take this example of Prithu Maharaj into ourselves? We're not kings or leaders or presidents or governors or something like that. But how we see how Prithu Maharaj is available to all of his citizens, maybe we ask ourselves, how available are we to others in our circle, in our community, or even to ourselves in our own spiritual practice, my own needs spiritually? How available am I to those needs, to fulfilling them, And it's not always easy, sometimes it's very uncomfortable to take responsibility of our spiritual life. Because in spiritual life, we get purified. So we are confronted with so much about ourselves that's not always nice to deal with. It's pretty unpleasant sometimes. And the thing about Krishna, we know in the Bhagavad Gita, the final thing he says, deliberate on this fully and then do what you wish to do. Krishna won't force us to be accountable or to take responsibility or any of those things. He wants us to do that ourselves because it's in that sphere where our devotion can grow. But we should understand also when we steer clear of taking responsibility for our spiritual life in some sense, we're kind of denying a personal relationship with Krishna. It's through accountability that we can develop that relationship with Krishna. And when we just don't want to take that, we cut off that part of it. Because ultimately, what does true accountability and responsibility mean for us? It means that accepting that I am a part and parcel of Krishna, I am a servant of Krishna, and I must act in such and such way. If I deny that, then I don't want to take responsibility for acting in service towards Krishna. And how do we do that? One way, we have to develop very deep, very meaningful relationships, personal relationships amongst each other, especially with spiritual individuals who can hold us accountable to something. Not, yes, your guru is there, but even a little more grassroots than that. We may not be in a position where we can always interact with our spiritual master, And when we don't do this, this is when impersonalism grows within our own hearts. Personalism means, that cut off. I expect the temple to be devotional for me. I expect everyone else to be devotional except myself, But just, externally being a devotee doesn't necessarily guarantee us a ticket back to Krishna. We have to put in that work. We have to do what we need to do, And sometimes if we're struggling with this, we need to ask ourselves, why don't I want to take responsibility? Responsibility takes effort. Maybe deep down I'm feeling like I'm not worth the effort. Responsibility is such hard work. It's going to take a lot for me to purify myself. I don't think it's worth it. And if we're saying this, are we inadvertently saying that I don't think Krishna is worth it? The effort in this way. So just, find people we can be accountable with, the way Maharaj Prithu was accountable to his citizens in that way. It takes a lot of commitment. Commitment is not something easily found in this day and age. My Guru Maharaj says that today, in this day and age, commitment is an exotic concept. It's not, but it's something that we have to strive for as devotees. Responsibility and accountability towards Krishna, towards ourselves, towards the community that we're a part of in that way. I will stop there. Comments, corrections, additions? Yes, you're going to have to use this one because we don't have another online.
Hare Krishna. Just a comment. I was thinking about something Kadambakana Maharaj would say about how if you look at the growth of ISKCON in the in times when Srila Prabhupada was physically present, and he aligned it with the growth of the European ages. So you get like when Jesus was present, and then the Dark Ages, and then the Renaissance. He looked at the time when the Srila Prabhupada was present, and then there was a period within ISKCON with the zonal acharyas and different things that he looked at as the Dark Ages, and then a break off into the Renaissance. And a key factor between these periods is responsibility. In that Dark Age scenario, there were some advantages because you were in a machine. And you didn't have to take, in one sense, personal responsibility because the machine was moving. Everybody was at Mangalarati. Everybody did agree. You couldn't stand out and be different. So therefore, you didn't have to take personal responsibility, and you just moved with the machine. And there was power in that because everybody completely aligned behind Srila Prabhupada. We completely focused on what Prabhupada wanted, and that's how we got so much done as a movement. But then, there was a period, within ISKCON history where that broke apart, and then everybody had to now find a spiritual life for themselves in some way. Not so many people living in the temple, a lot more grihastas, and that's where personal responsibility became more of a focus. So now that, if you want to be at Mangalarti, you can. If you don't want to be, you don't have to be. Or if you're living outside the temple, especially if you're living outside the temple, then, who's watching if you're in, if you're not, if you're chanting, if you're not, So it's interesting that it's not to say that one age is better than the other, but that they have different perks, because now in the Renaissance era, people have a bit more individual expression, and that bhakti can actually flow more freely. So this thing you're mentioning about now us taking personal responsibility for our spiritual lives is a key factor for the age, especially that we're living in. Just so.
Yeah, it's and it's like you're saying, both have their perks, because there are days where I do not want to be responsible for anything. So it's nice to just fit into the flow, and especially when you're just coming into spiritual life, the flow really takes you where you need to be. But as you grow and mature, you find your own, because your enthusiasm has to come from yourself for sustainability. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
Hare Krishna. Thanks, Gaura Bhumi, for a wonderful class. These are some of the points that I remember and you illustrated them well with so many anecdotes and examples. The king should be able to protect his citizens, or is not intelligent or false. And you demonstrated that with the story of the Brahmin and the dead child from Krishna book. And what I learnt from here in responsibility is the criteria for success in life is whether or not Krishna is pleased with what we're doing. So that's very important framework for everything we do. Saintly person is concerned with the unhappiness of everyone and the happiness of everyone. So on that point there, and you said our Krishna conscious movement is not a selfish movement, what Srila Prabhupada said. So those 2 points. Then you mentioned how in society we get the diplomatic runaround and people don't want to take responsibility. So in terms of our personal responsibility, how do we execute that? Do we get the diplomatic runaround in our temple when we try to get help? And what about the lack of friendliness? We find people say devotees don't greet, faced with sulkiness and all those kinds of interactions, especially in the front line where people are, how do we respond to that? Now if we're all going to take personal responsibility, but there is a collective responsibility for movement because people from the outside look up to the devotees in the temple. I look up to the devotees in the temple, and there's a certain expectation. So how would you comment on something like that? Then I'll ask another question.
I would say it's something I'm also guilty of, Prabhu. And I find that I'm just speaking personally, I'm not manager or any kind of authority person. Sometimes spiritual life brings up a lot of hardships. There are days when the japa brings out the ugliest things, and it's going to come out somewhere, and unfortunately it doesn't come out on me. It comes out on Rukmini or someone, Why a devotee would, when they come and they say, and yes, I've experienced that. I personally, I'll speak honestly, when we first moved here, I didn't like coming to the temple. Yes, personally we were going through something very trying in our family, but I didn't like coming to the temple. It was so different from the way I was raised. I didn't fit in with anyone. I couldn't speak to people. It took me like 2 or 3 years to actually connect with someone and, make a friend. And I think that's one of the downfalls of the bigger an organization gets. You get lost in it. I don't expect the temple, someone to, a manager to greet every single person. How do you remember everyone, And unfortunately, in some sense, I have no answer because it's something I'm still struggling with. So when I figure out, but then maybe that's something I can ask someone who's like an authority or a manager. How do you fix the cracks? And I think we're coming out of the dark ages. It's been some time since the dark ages, but we're still reaping the effects of them in many ways. But I think the process of Krishna consciousness individually is meant to bring us to a certain platform. However long it takes, that's an individual thing based on how much anarthas and whatever you're going through, your karma. But I think it's something we hold ourselves to. Am I becoming more peaceful? Am I becoming more friendly? Am I becoming more open? And if I'm not, something is not right in my practice, maybe somewhere. I know one of my godbrothers was telling me he was really struggling, and it's not like he knew what was wrong. It's like he was doing everything he had to do, and he just wasn't feeling the way a devotee should feel. And my Guru Maharaj just said, there's something wrong with your chanting. And I think it starts from perhaps there, the chanting of the Lord's holy name, when we do it with sincerity and honesty. Yes, we know the saying is chant and be happy, but happiness doesn't come every day when you pick up your beads. So there's a saying, Deva Madhava Prabhu, he runs a North American center, I forget which one, but he says in their community, they don't say chant and be happy, they say chant and be honest. Chant and be honest. And I think it's something we need to work on, even just amongst ourselves, finding those spaces with devotees where we can come and say, Prabhu, I'm not okay today. I really don't feel like chanting. Because, you say that and you get the generic answer, Prabhu, just try, pick up your beads, No one wants to listen to you. We all just want to talk to each other. We don't want to listen to what each other's coming with. And, we come and we try to spiritualize everything in our life. And we cut off so much, but we forget that we're still human. And we're still conditioned and we're still covered by so much. We still need to hold space for that, even in spiritual circles. It's not just, natural elevation. We still have to hold space for the human side and the things that it brings. Yeah.
Thanks, Guru Bhumi. I always appreciated you being as young as you are. You have a very mature understanding of Krishna consciousness. It comes out in your classes and, also in your soft demeanor. But one thing I want to respond to that is, I think the more you get spiritual, the more human you get, rather than divorcing the two, right? So you can't, kind of like, because that makes you more embracing of everybody, and therefore these points about being concerned with the unhappiness of everyone, it increases actually, and less selfish, because our movement is not a selfish movement. So I think that's what happens, because you see how when the devotees develop spiritually, then they can just be so magnanimous with everybody, right? So now, I have this problem. I want somebody to sort it out for me. I don't know where. See, we all have different psychosocial, emotional natures, so that's granted that we'll respond differently. But I get into the lift, only 4 floors I live, but it's like 6 floors because of the parking. I get into the lift and there's a stranger there. By the time I go down in 2 minutes, I know their problems, because they just tell me, whoosh, I had this and it just comes out. I don't know what it is, wherever I go, like, so, and then I had somebody the other day send me a message, Prabhu, there's this person who's having this difficulty, can I give your number? And so on. And then I had to write back and say, can you find out the nature of the problem, and then I can discuss it, right? So where do I draw the line, or where do you draw the line in terms of being concerned about the unhappiness of others? Jai, you want to answer?
I was thinking of this, of responsibility. I was thinking of ombudsman, this word. Ombudsman. What's the definition of ombudsman? Like a person. Ombudsman. I think ISKCON also, we have an ombudsman, isn't that kind of neutral and arbitrary in problems and solving problems? So the leader ideally should be like that also. Of course, ISKCON now is progressed. I mean, we have teacher training, management training, leadership training is all there. And it's very much highlighted in Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj's books, Leadership Pura. Isn't many of his books have given that. So I always see Bhakti Tirtha as, he's gone before his time. Now is the time for him to be present, isn't it, in this time of the... Yeah, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada, in the first canto, when Prabhupada, in that verse where he described the symptoms of Kali Yuga, and he says one of the symptoms that people, their over-dependence on another's mercy. Over-dependence on another's mercy. So when we see that people are very dysfunctional and so many problems are there, mental and physical and all that. But to be devotee is also, we aspiring to be, also get out of the material world. And all the things are there, the facilities are there. We have this beautiful temple, we have beautiful deities, we have wonderful literature, and we have wonderful association. But ultimately we are flying, everyone's flying their own plane. That is responsibility. We all, like you mentioned, on Sunday also you mentioned, you gave the synopsis of Bhagavad Gita and you said, Krishna is saying to Arjuna, I've told you everything, now you deliberate. And you mentioned again today that same. So we have, we have all this, but we have to deliberate on what to do. That means taking responsibility. So that was my take on that. Hare Krishna.
Just refresh my mind, Prabhu. What was the... Oh, yes. To what degree do we be concerned with the unhappiness of others? The thing is, to the degree that you are capable of managing, if I'm in a space where, yes, okay, I'm a counselor, but I wake up every morning dreading to listen to everyone's problems, that means something is wrong. So yes, ultimately, your first responsibility is to yourself and your own sadhana. And that is ultimately what gives us strength in spiritual life, strong sadhana, strong devotional practice. And you judge for yourself, because even day to day, our capacity is different. Today I'm at 100, tomorrow I'm at 50. What can you hold space for today? And you decide for yourself like that. Yes, Prabhu, today I can hear you. Another day, okay, I'm not in a good space right now. Can I come back to you at another time? We just, we do things and then we burn ourselves out, and then what happens? It becomes a burden. Prabhupada was saying that actually in one of the morning classes on the Mondays. I think it was the day before Prabhupada's disappearance day. That Monday he was speaking about how enthusiasm and determination and dedication is so important in our life, that when we lose our enthusiasm, we start seeing the spiritual master and the deity as a burden. So we have to check in with ourselves what our consciousness is like. If I'm starting to see that my service is becoming a burden, I need to stop, I need to reassess, I need to rejuvenate a little bit. So that'll change day to day. But ultimately, our first responsibility is to our own sadhana. You know, a sadhu, yes, gives of themselves, but not at the cost of themselves, because we have to serve. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in ISKCON, and we have to be here as long as we can. So, yeah. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Grantaraj, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.